On my 27th birthday, my parents sent me a gift box. My husband looked at it once and turned pale. He grabbed my wrist. "Don't open it." His voice didn't shake, but something in his eyes did. I frowned. "Why?" He pointed to the corner of the box. "Can't you see it?" I looked closer. There, beneath the ribbon, was a dark red smear dried almost brown. It smelled faintly metallic, like blood. Like someone had touched the package with stained hands and wanted me to notice. I didn't open it. I stepped back, dialed 911. 30 minutes later, two officers stood in my living room. One took the box. The other asked me a question that made my heart stop. "Miss Arden, has your family ever sent you anything?" Threatening, I couldn't speak. Because the truth was, they had. Not with knives or letters, but with silence, with blame, with the way they twisted love into something I had to survive. Hi, I'm Miraa Arden. And this is the story of what my parents tried to do to me on my birthday. Not with a bomb, not with poison, with something far more permanent, a lie wrapped in a box meant to destroy everything I had left. If you've ever been betrayed by blood, silenced by those who raised you, or told you were too sensitive to survive the truth, this story is for you. Before I share everything, I'd love to know you're here with me. Just drop a "listening" in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. I want to know who's on the other side, because sometimes even one listener can make the pain feel heard. And if you believe stories like mine deserve a voice, please consider subscribing. You being here, it matters more than you know. Thank you. And now, let me tell you what was really inside that box. My name is Miraa Arden. I'm 27 and I live in Savannah, Georgia, in a creaky little house with honey-colored floors and windows that flood the kitchen with morning light. My husband Grayson is a wood sculptor, quiet, steady, and patient, and I restore antique objects for a living. We run a small workshop together just off Bull Street, tucked between a gallery and a florist. Our life is quiet, honest, and ours. But no matter how far I build myself from it, the past has a way of slipping under the door like cold air. Charleston isn't far away, 2 hours by car, but in my mind, it's another world entirely. That's where I was raised. That's where I learned how deeply family can wound, not with violence, but with silence comparisons, and a kind of favoritism that leaves you questioning your own worth. My parents, Margaret and Edward Arden, own a modest antique shop in downtown Charleston. It's been in our family for 3 generations. They run it like a kingdom, and the crown jewel of that kingdom has always been my younger sister, Serafina. She's 3 years younger than me, a whirlwind of charm, spontaneity, and recklessness. Since we were children, Serafina was always the muse, the one our mother said had an eye for beauty, even when all she did was scribble in colored pencil on the back of my schoolwork. I, on the other hand, was responsible, reliable. The big sister, which in our house meant scapegoat, fall guy, babysitter. I remember 2 moments as clearly as if they were branded into me. I was 10. Serafina had gotten into the display cabinet and shattered a Ming Dynasty porcelain vase with her skipping rope. When our mother stormed into the room, Serafina burst into tears and pointed at me. I hadn't even touched the cabinet, but Margaret didn't hesitate. She yanked me by the arm and hissed, "You were supposed to be watching her." Serafina, still sniffling, was handed a lollipop, while I was made to sweep up the shards. 4 years later, I had spent weeks carefully restoring a centuries-old painting, a birthday gift from my grandfather. I'd hidden it in my closet wrapped in silk. One afternoon, Serafina decided she needed the silk for a school project and accidentally tore the canvas while digging through my things. When I showed my mother the damage, her response was a tired sigh. "Well, why didn't you store it somewhere safer?" Serafina shrugged and went back to painting her nails. That's how it always went. She would break things. I would be expected to fix them, or worse, take the blame. By the time we were adults, our paths couldn't have looked more different. I went to college, studied restoration, and moved to Savannah to build something for myself. Grayson and I met at a vintage furniture fair, and in him, I found someone who didn't ask me to be anything but who I was. Together, we opened our workshop and built a life where no one measured me against anyone else. Serafina, meanwhile, drifted. She dropped out of art school after one semester, tried selling miniature statues at flea markets, opened, then quickly closed a booth for old prints. None of it stuck. And yet Margaret always praised her as bold, creative, free-spirited. I was safe, predictable. Steady like that was a curse. A year ago, I was invited somewhat surprisingly back to Charleston for lunch. Margaret and Serafina met me at a trendy downtown cafe, all smiles and saccharine tones. After the entrees, they dropped the real reason they'd invited me. Serafina's starting a new antiques venture, Margaret had said, reaching across the table. She just needs a stable name to register the business under. Yours, just for the paperwork, no big deal. I laughed, thinking they were joking. But they weren't. I told them no, flat out. My name, my address, my credit score, it wasn't going to be the foundation for someone else's shortcuts. That was the last I heard from them. After that, I wasn't invited home for Thanksgiving. Serafina blocked me on every platform. My calls went unanswered. The silence was loud, sharp-edged, and deliberate. I thought I'd finally stepped out of the family's shadow into a life that was mine. I thought I had built walls strong enough to keep their chaos out. But then on my 27th birthday, they sent me a box. The call came the day before my birthday. Margaret's name lit up my phone screen, and I stared at it for a full ring before answering. Her voice was sweet, too sweet. The kind of softness reserved for bedtime stories or deathbeds. "Hi, love," she cooed. "I just wanted you to know we've sent you something, a little birthday present, just a small token." I blinked. "You sent me something?" "We've been thinking about you," she said. "It's time we made things right. We were wrong to make you feel left out." It was the first time in my life she'd ever admitted to anything remotely resembling guilt. I ended the call politely but unsettled. When I told Grayson, he didn't even try to sugarcoat his reaction. "Don't open it," he said. "Whatever it is, you haven't even seen it yet." I don't have to. My birthday morning was golden and quiet. Grayson made my favorite breakfast eggs over easy and black coffee with a splash of almond milk. The air smelled like cinnamon and pine wood from his latest carving. For a moment I almost forgot that anything was amiss. Then the doorbell rang. A courier stood on our front step holding a large wooden box. No ribbon, no card, just a printed shipping label with my full name and address. It was heavy, unvarnished, and faintly smelled of lacquer. Grayson squinted at a small emblem burned into the side, an old crest from a Charleston-based antiques supplier. I saw his face change instantly. "This is from that place Serafina used to work with," he muttered. "They went under last year, got caught selling forged certificates." I leaned in. The box didn't look like a gift, it looked like cargo. Grayson put his hand gently over mine. "Do not open this. Something's wrong." Before I could respond, my phone rang again. Margaret. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," she sang. "Did you get the box?" I did. I said, choosing my words carefully. "Isn't it lovely?" she continued. "Did you see the little rosewood figurine and the miniature paintings? I thought of you the moment we picked them out." I hadn't opened the box. How could she possibly know what was inside? I swallowed. "Yes, they're beautiful." Grayson, watching me closely, mouthed, "Record this." I hit the button to start audio capture on my phone and kept my voice steady as Margaret continued to describe each item in vivid detail, pieces I hadn't even touched. After the call ended, Grayson stared at the box like it was ticking. "We need to call the police. Are you serious?" He didn't blink. "Yes." The Savannah police arrived 30 minutes later. I explained everything, played the recording, and gave them permission to inspect the contents. They pried the lid off and began carefully removing the items: a small rosewood figurine, 3 framed miniatures, and several certificates of authenticity. Except, the certificates were printed on incorrect stock paper, missing key embossing marks. One officer scanned the QR codes attached to the pieces. each one linked to websites flagged in an ongoing federal investigation into antique smuggling and forgery. My name, Miraa Arden, was listed as the buyer on one of the included documents. One officer pulled me aside. His tone was calm but direct. "Ma'am, your name is on the paperwork, and you received the shipment at your home. Unless you can prove otherwise, you could be considered part of the operation." I felt something cold and ancient crawl up my spine. They told me I wasn't under arrest but advised me not to leave the state until further notice. They logged the box as evidence, sealed it, and left with the pieces in the back of a patrol SUV. After the door closed behind them, I leaned against the wall, shaking. Grayson wrapped his arms around me, but my thoughts were miles away, back in Charleston, back in the past, back to Margaret's voice dripping with honey. She hadn't sent me a gift. She'd sent me a trap. A week after the police took the box, just as I was beginning to breathe, without checking the mailbox first, the phone rang again. It wasn't Margaret this time. It was a federal investigator named Detective Hoyt. His tone was calm, clipped, and rehearsed. He spoke like a man used to giving people bad news they didn't expect. "Ms. Arden," he said, "your name has appeared on several documents tied to a suspected antiquities smuggling operation currently under investigation. We'd like to ask you a few questions." My hand tightened around the phone. I stepped out onto the porch, hoping the air might cool the rising heat under my skin. He sent me images, scans of business permits, digital forms, and an email chain from an address I had never seen before, Miraa92@antiqueart.designs. The signature on the documents was my name, digitally signed. There were tax IDs and purchase orders, all tied to the name Miraa Arden, all tied to me. But they weren't mine. I told him I had never used that email, that I'd never signed a single business license outside of my own restoration work. I emailed him copies of my actual email account, my digital signature, and bank statements, showing no connection to any of the transactions in question. His response was measured, professional, but it didn't reassure me. "We believe the documentation was fabricated. However, it was filed using a former residential address in Charleston, your previous address, correct?" I nodded before realizing he couldn't see me. "Yes. I lived there for 3 years, before I moved to Savannah." He paused, then continued. "The business was registered under the name Mira's Finds. The legal representative listed on the filing is Margaret Arden." I stood there frozen, the wind tugging gently at my shirt, like even it wanted to pull me out of my body. Serafina had worked at that address. She used it for her failed print stall. It was barely more than a pop-up stand tucked behind a bakery, but now I realized it had been something more, a launch pad for a name that wasn't hers. He confirmed what I was beginning to fear. Serafina had used my identity, my name, my former address, even forged an email in my likeness, to start a business I had never even heard of. And Margaret had helped her. I asked the detective what would have happened if I had opened that birthday box. "If you had opened it, your fingerprints would have been on the contents. Combined with the documentation, it could have been enough to implicate you. We've seen this before, family members laundering goods through someone else's name, hoping the paper trail sticks to the wrong person." I hung up the call and sat in silence for a long time, staring at the cup of tea I'd forgotten on the kitchen counter. It had gone cold. Grayson came in from the workshop, saw my face, and didn't ask anything. He just sat beside me and held my hand. There were no tears, no screams, just a quiet ache, heavy and sharp, like something deep inside had finally torn loose. I whispered, "Why me? Why did they choose me?" And for once, there was no answer. A month passed. I hadn't heard from Margaret or Serafina, no more boxes, no more phone calls. For a while, I let myself believe it might be over. Then Detective Hoyt called again. He informed me that a second shipment had been discovered, this time at a private storage facility outside Charleston. Antique figurines, paintings, and relics estimated to be worth tens of thousands of dollars. The documents attached to the shipment listed me, Miraa Arden, as the purchaser. The delivery destination, my workshop address in Savannah. I felt the floor slide beneath me. I asked him if this was enough for a formal charge. "You're not under arrest," he said, "but you are now a primary person of interest." I was asked to appear at the Savannah precinct for formal questioning. Grayson came with me. I brought everything: my bank statements, the recording of Margaret's call photos of the original box, a printed copy of the email Hoyt had sent me. My hands trembled as I passed them across the table to the officer. I told my story again, careful and clear. I emphasized that I had never agreed to let anyone use my name, that the business was fraudulent, that I had already provided proof to the federal office. When I was released hours later, exhausted and pale, I stepped into the parking lot and my phone buzzed. "Margaret," I answered. "Miraa." She began, her voice thick and theatrical. "You can't let this get out. Serafina isn't built for this. She's fragile. You've always been stronger." I asked her directly, "Did you know she was using my name?" Silence. Then, in a whisper, she needed help. And we thought, maybe it wouldn't matter. It mattered. I hung up. At home, I found an email from Edward. It was short, carefully neutral. He suggested I find legal representation to handle the misunderstanding, and reminded me that family reputation is delicate. Let's not turn this into a scandal. He didn't apologize. He didn't deny knowing. He was telling me to take the fall. Quietly. Later that night, Serafina texted me. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I'm sorry." Before I could respond, another message came through. "You always overreact. I just needed you to back me up like always." I stared at the screen, the words pulsing like a wound. It wasn't remorse. It was fear, fear of being caught. And worse, the assumption that I would still protect her. I didn't reply. The next day, the local Savannah paper ran a headline with my name in it. "Antique Restoration Specialist, under investigation in smuggling case." No charges had been filed, but it didn't matter. The words were there, black and bold and unforgiving. Clients stopped replying to my emails. Collaborators ghosted me. One longtime collector from Charleston canceled our contract. $30,000 in restoration work vanished in a single email. "We can't be tied to this kind of publicity," he wrote. "I hope you understand." I did. Too well. I spent hours in my studio that night, brushing dust off half-finished frames, running my hands over cracked wood, trying to remember why I ever loved this work. It had once brought me peace. Now it just reminded me of everything I was losing. I sat on the workbench, the only sound the low whir of the ceiling fan and the faint creak of timber shifting in the walls. I asked myself a question I never thought I'd ask. If I took the blame, would this end? Could I carry it for them? Just one last time. Then I caught sight of the burned crest on the shipping box, still tucked in the back corner of the room. The one with my name on it. The one I never opened. And I thought, maybe, for the first time with certainty, that I couldn't carry this. Not again. Not anymore. Sleep left me. Every night I stared at the ceiling, waiting for daylight, like it might bring answers. At 3 a.m., I would wander to the living room and sit in silence, surrounded by half-done restoration projects that no longer felt like mine. I couldn't touch them. My hands trembled too easily now. Grayson found me one of those nights. He didn't speak at first. He just walked over, sat down, and offered me his shoulder. I leaned into him, not for comfort, but because I didn't know what else to do. He didn't ask questions, but eventually I did. "If I get charged," I whispered, "what happens to you?" He looked at me like he didn't understand the language I was speaking. "Then we fight it," he said simply. "Together. I'm not letting you walk through this alone." But I had already started the process of pushing him away. It wasn't fair to let him stand in the line of fire. He had his own life, his own name untainted. Mine was becoming a shadow of suspicion. I told myself I was protecting him, but deep down I didn't want him to see how much I was breaking. A few days later, he sat across from me, 2 cups of tea cooling between us. "If they forged your identity," he said, "they left digital footprints. Nobody pulls this off clean. We just have to dig. We started going through old emails, business receipts, invoices, anything from the last 3 years that could connect Serafina Margaret or even Edward to what was happening. Grayson suggested we reach out to Naomi, a former staff member from Margaret's Finds, who had always seemed uneasy around Serafina. Naomi didn't say much over the phone, but she sent me a batch of old emails and spreadsheets from when she worked under Serafina, saying only, "You might want to look through these carefully." One email stood out. Dated nearly 2 years ago, it was from Serafina. The subject line was innocent enough about the Botticelli reproduction, but attached was an Excel file simply titled Antique Tracking. Inside the first sheet listed usual things, names of paintings, brief descriptions, vague delivery notes. But Grayson noticed something strange. A second tab hidden and labeled Delivery M revealed rows of transactions, real artifacts, real addresses, and mine was listed over a dozen times. My old address in Charleston, my full name, the buyer's email, Miraa92@antiqueart.designs. But it was Grayson's background in tech that gave us our breakthrough. He ran the file through metadata analysis software and found that the original creator of the file had left behind a digital fingerprint. Author Serafina MacBook. There it was. Proof. Not just circumstantial, not hearsay. A time-stamped record that Serafina had forged transaction records under my name using her own laptop. We packaged everything, the original email, the spreadsheet, the metadata logs, and sent them to Detective Hoyt with a full explanation. He called me within 2 hours. "You just saved yourself," he said. "And you've brought your sister into full prosecutorial view." I couldn't breathe at first. The weight of fear I'd carried for weeks didn't fall away. It cracked all at once like old porcelain under heat. I stepped out of the studio into the thick summer rain of Savannah. It soaked through my shirt and into my bones, but I didn't move. The relief wasn't clean, because I knew what would come next. This was no longer about what they felt for me. It was about what they had done to me. And justice didn't recognize family. I was walking into war. The next morning I got the call. Detective Hoyt told me the files I'd sent had been forwarded to the Charleston District Attorney. They were enough. Serafina was to be arrested on charges of identity theft, mail fraud, and trafficking in stolen antiquities. I didn't know how to feel. I sat in the kitchen as the news spread, watching it happen in real time. Local stations were the first. A clip from Charleston aired within hours, Serafina being led down the steps of her apartment building in handcuffs, shielding her face from the cameras. The anchor's voice was calm, clinical. Well-known local artist and daughter of philanthropist Edward Arden, Serafina Arden, has been taken into custody following an ongoing investigation into fraudulent antique sales. They cut to a reporter on the scene. He called her a manipulative figure who used her sister's name to cover criminal activity. But it was what happened in the final seconds of the broadcast that left me cold. A reporter shouted, "Serafina, do you have anything to say?" She turned, faced the camera squarely and said, "They knew. All of them. They let me do it." The phone rang almost immediately after. It was Detective Hoyt. He told me that Margaret and Edward were now under investigation. That financial records had surfaced showing a joint bank account tied to both of them had been used to pay for the storage unit where the artifacts had been found. Shipments too had been traced back to expenses on that same account. They weren't just complicit, they had funded it. Later that week, I was contacted by the prosecutor's office. They asked me to serve as the primary witness in the preliminary hearing. I would need to testify under oath about everything, from the birthday box to the spreadsheet metadata, from the phone calls to the betrayals. I agreed. But that night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling like I was preparing to take a knife to my own ribs. How do you speak against the people who raised you? How do you testify knowing it might land your sister, your father, and your mother behind bars? The next morning, Grayson made breakfast, then sat down across from me. "There's something I never told you," he said, voice low. Last year, Edward came by the studio when you weren't home. He asked me if you'd be willing to let them use your business name on some paperwork. Said it was just to help Serafina qualify for a permit. I stared at him. I said no, he continued. I said you'd never go for that. And he smiled this cold little smile and said, Mira's stubborn, but eventually she'll remember that family is everything. I didn't respond. I didn't have to. It all made sense now. They had been planning this long before the box arrived. They were just waiting for the right crisis, the right moment to fold me into it. I spent the evening in the living room. I stared into the mirror above the fireplace, into a face that looked like mine but felt unfamiliar. Was I naive for believing that blood meant protection? That loyalty was something shared, not demanded? Maybe. But I wasn't naive anymore. The courthouse in Charleston looked more like a press conference than a courtroom that morning. Reporters lined the steps, microphones in hand, calling names, snapping photos of anyone who looked remotely involved. Grayson stood beside me, his hand resting lightly on my back, guiding me forward. Inside, the benches were full. The judge's bench loomed like a stage. I didn't expect to see so many faces, strangers, reporters, people from our old neighborhood. But the moment I saw Margaret step out of the black car, I froze. She wore a gray wool coat, the collar turned up. Her hair pinned neatly under a scarf. A string of pearls circled her neck. The same ones she wore to Sunday church, to fundraisers, to Serafina's gallery openings. She looked like she was still auditioning for the role of moral matriarch. When I was called to the stand, my hands trembled slightly, but I gripped the edge of the witness box and kept my voice steady. I recounted everything from the first strange call on my birthday to the unopened box, the audio file Serafina had carelessly left behind, and the moment we uncovered the metadata tied directly to her MacBook. Every word felt like peeling back layers of old paint, exposing rot beneath. When I presented the printed email with the embedded metadata, the courtroom stilled. The defense lawyer tried to object, but the judge overruled. The evidence was clear, untouched, time-stamped. Next, it was Serafina's turn. She wore pale beige and looked smaller than I remembered, thinner, diminished. She avoided looking at me. At first, she denied everything, but when asked about the storage facility, the bank account, and the transactions linked to my name, her voice cracked. She began to cry, not performative sobs, but quiet, angry tears. It wasn't just me, she said. Mom said it was safer this way. Dad opened the account. I only followed instructions. Then she turned to Margaret and said, You told me Miraa wouldn't care, that she didn't have kids, didn't have anything to lose. Well, now what? The silence in the courtroom deepened. You could feel it like weight. Margaret was next. She sat with her back straight, fingers interlaced. When asked about her involvement, she said she had only ever wanted to help her daughter, that Serafina had always been fragile, and that she had never expected things to spiral like this. But the prosecution presented documents, fund transfers, payment receipts, and the signed rental agreement for the warehouse storing the illegal antiques, all linked to a joint account held by Margaret and Edward. The courtroom watched as Margaret's carefully built persona unraveled. The judge called a recess. Outside, I sat on the stone steps, the summer sun hitting my shoulders. Grayson handed me a bottle of water but said nothing. Inside, everything was crumbling, years of lies, performances, curated public image, and I was watching it all collapse brick by brick. As we left, I looked back. Serafina sat slumped in her chair, eyes on the floor. Margaret stared blankly ahead. Edward kept his gaze low, hands clenched in his lap. I couldn't tell if justice had been served or if I had simply buried the remnants of a family that had been decaying for far longer than I dared admit. The verdict came on a Wednesday. Serafina was sentenced to 3 years in federal prison for identity theft, wire fraud, and trafficking stolen antiques. Margaret and Edward received suspended sentences and 200 hours of community service each. They were also ordered to pay financial restitution and make a public acknowledgement of their role in defaming me. When the ruling was announced, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. The Charleston Chronicle ran a headline the next day: Betrayed by Blood, Miraa Arden breaks, silence brings down family operation. It painted me as resilient, principled, a woman who had stood her ground. I read it twice, not because I needed to, but because I didn't quite recognize the person they described. That week, restoration studios that had quietly distanced themselves began emailing again. A collector from New Orleans asked if I would take on a Louis XVI portrait set. I said yes. But not everything was forward motion. One late afternoon, just before sundown, I heard a knock at the door. Through the frosted glass, I saw a figure in a beige coat and another in a dark blue blazer. I opened it without a word. Margaret stood there, pearl necklace in place, eyes rimmed red but dry. Edward held a manila envelope and an old family photo, one from a beach trip in Hilton Head, before Serafina became Serafina the artist, before Margaret became Margaret the donor, before I knew what they were all capable of. "We came to talk," Margaret said softly. "You have to understand. We didn't want this. We didn't want her to go to prison. She made a mistake. She's your sister. I didn't invite them in. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at them, truly looked, and felt nothing." "No," I said. "You made your choices long before this. You chose her, over and over, and now I choose me." I closed the door slowly, gently. No slam, no dramatics, just finality. In my office that evening, I placed the photo they'd left on the desk. We were all smiling in it, a blur of beach wind and sunburned shoulders. I flipped it over and wrote in pencil, "Freedom doesn't always come from revenge. Sometimes it comes from walking away." Then I tucked it into a drawer. The light through the workshop window fell across the canvas of a gilded frame I had been too afraid to touch for weeks. I picked up a brush, dipped it in gold leaf paint, and started again. Outside, Savannah breathed. And so did I. Some nights I sat in front of the mirror and stared into it for hours, not out of vanity, but because I no longer recognized the woman looking back at me. The trial was over. Names had been read. Sentences delivered. My name cleared. And yet, what I felt wasn't vindication, it was hollowness. Like someone had taken a chisel to the center of me and carved out everything that once held shape. Grayson noticed before I could say it aloud. He found a therapist in Savannah, someone who specialized in family trauma. I went reluctantly at first, but over time, I learned how to sit with the silence I'd always filled with tasks, with perfection, with proving. I learned how to say the words betrayal, abandonment, shame, words I had folded away since I was 5. Then came the public statement from the Charleston District Attorney's Office. After thorough investigation, Ms. Miraa Arden has been fully cleared of all criminal allegations. The statement ran in newspapers, but it was the feature in Southern Antiquity that reached the furthest. A full-page spread titled, "The Restorer Who Was Nearly Destroyed," tracing the story of how I'd been made a scapegoat by my own family and how I'd stood through the collapse of it. One morning, I found an envelope at the studio door. Inside was a handwritten letter from a collector in New Orleans, a prominent one. "We have followed your work for years and more recently, your story. We believe in your eye and more importantly, your integrity. We would be honored if you restored our 18th century French collection." Grayson read the letter aloud, then folded it with care. "It's time," he said, squeezing my hand. "Time for you to stand in the light that's always been yours." Clients returned, many with apologies. Old colleagues from Atlanta reached out. One invited me to give the keynote at a symposium on restoration ethics. I accepted, but clarified my subject. I'll speak about the fragility of trust, especially when it breaks at the hands of blood. A week before the symposium, I received a letter in Margaret's handwriting. The envelope was thin, almost hesitant. Inside, a single sheet. I was wrong. Not for what I did to protect Serafina, but for what I failed to do for you. I made you the scapegoat long before this, when you were 5, and quiet and easier to ignore. I didn't reply. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I folded it and placed it gently into the same drawer where I kept my therapy journal, a record of harm and healing. Months later, at a flea market on River Street, I saw a small wooden figure, weathered, chipped, its face barely visible. It looked exactly like the one they had tried to ruin me with. I didn't turn away. I bought it. Back at the studio, I cleaned it, restored its worn surfaces, and placed it at the entrance of my workshop, not as a warning, but as a reminder that what was meant to break me had become the thing that told the truth. Exactly 1 year after that birthday, after the call, the package, the unraveling, I stood beneath the carved wooden sign of our new studio, Verdant Reverie. It was a dream Grayson and I built together. His sculptures now lived beside my restored antiques. Metal and marble met wood and pigment. Clients came from across the Southeast bringing heirlooms, fragments, and untold stories. Here, every item we touched was made whole again, not just repaired, but honored. One afternoon, a teenage intern named Lila looked up from the tray of cracked porcelain she was sorting and asked me plainly, "Ms. Miraa, why do you restore things instead of collecting them?" I smiled, setting down the brush. "Because the broken things, if they're still beautiful, they deserve to be seen, not hidden." It wasn't a rehearsed line. It was simply the truth. The kind of truth you find only after everything false has been stripped away. I didn't keep in touch with my family, not in the way people expect when they hear that word. But I had built a different kind of family. Fellow artisans who invited me to their homes, neighbors who stopped by with coffee and questions, people who called me the older sister of the antique world. I no longer waited for a message from my mother. I no longer replayed my father's half-hearted hugs. That hunger for their approval had finally stopped gnawing. On my 28th birthday, Grayson threw a small dinner in the courtyard behind the studio. There were strings of warm lights, jazz playing softly, a lemon cake from my favorite bakery, and people who clapped when I walked in, not because they were related to me, but because they chose me. When they sang happy birthday, I didn't have to fake joy. I felt it, deep in my chest. Later that night, I placed the restored wooden statue on the windowsill. I wiped the dust from its curves, watching the last light of day spill across it. It no longer frightened me. It wasn't the package that nearly ruined me. It was a reminder of where I began. One morning, while sipping coffee beside Grayson, I stared at the statue and said quietly, "Do you think one day I'll forgive them?" He reached for my hand. I didn't wait for his answer. "I guess it's okay not to know. This life, it's mine now." I stood and opened the studio door. Morning light spilled across the floor, catching the golden threads in the woven rug, the patina on the bronze bust in the corner. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to earn anyone's love. I didn't feel like I was chasing anything. I belonged to myself, and I was done betraying that.